it seems to me, Doctor, then that I mean, there was a controversy a few years back. There seems to be one every year nowadays, where there's a period drama and it's set in Tudor England or some kind of
Yeah,
Renaissance era, and there's a black
yeah,
individual or black character, and the for want of a better word, I'm being kind here, the keyboard warriors and the bloggers and the vloggers
yeah,
and the YouTube content creators, they
yeah.
all get to their devices and they're putting out content denouncing this false historicity of this drama and whatnot. So, but from what you're saying, it seems quite feasible, not even feasible, but that perhaps there's even more of a black presence than we've been led to believe by popular culture and Hollywood. I want to ask you specifically, can you, how should I phrase this? How many in your research, how many
How
could you get a
many?
handle on how many of uh how great this black presence in England was at this time?
It's almost in. Thank you ever so much for asking those two questions. They're really important. The first question that you asked was about how TV producers and directors make their TV programs. Well, there's often a complete artistic failure on the part of these producers and directors to introduce this important and significant history to the British public. A systemic failure, because what they often do is don't consult people like me who have some understanding of this history, who could inform them about how they could make this history relevant to the evidence that's available. And instead, they sort of develop this sort of PC woke thing in space,
Mm.
a kind of pastiche in space, and insert this person or people in the most ludicrous and ridiculous way. And they are doing the most ludicrous and ridiculous things, and they speak and talk and act in the most ridiculous and ludicrous ways. Now, the audience that sees this, of course, instinctively react. Sometimes they react simply because they don't like the face. But sometimes they're reacting because the circumstance situation seems so unutterably illogical. And often it is. This is sometimes because they overemphasize something that should be underestimated and
Mm.
underestimate something that should be overestimated. So I'll give an example. In St. Butolph without Aldgate, which is a parish in the East End of London, the population of that parish during from about the middle part of Elizabeth's reign to the end part of Elizabeth's reign, according to the parish records, about 5% of that population are people of African descent. 5% is a
Wow.
lot.
Wow.
5% is a lot. That's according to the records, right? It may be more, but that's what the records we can say with some kind of surety, and that's by counting every record. By counting every record in the parish, and then counting every record of a person of African descent, and then drawing up a percentage, right? And so about 5%. So we could have a TV drama, and I've said this to producers and directors, we could have a TV drama, not just with a few individuals in St. Butolph without Aldgate, but with communities. Brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, blah, 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 right? Moreover, in St. Butolph without Aldgate, not only is there a strong African presence, there is a strong presence of non-white English people. So not
Mm.
sorry, non-white and non-English people, should I say.
Mm-hmm.
So these are people of Spanish origin, of French origin, from what is now modern day Italy, Native Americans. We find a multitude of different people. And these non-English people, people of non-English descent people, make up a majority of the St. Butolph without Aldgate area. So if you went to St. Butolph in the 15th century, you would see that the majority of people are not, Hearts of Oak, Shakespeare's children. They are not those people. The people that you would find would be Jewish Sephardi travelers that have come from Spain. You'd find merchants from Venice. You'd find Native Americans from New England. You find North African potentates. You find West African potentates, and you find the occasional East African potentate. You find African Moors from Spain, and African Moors from France, and African Moors from what is now modern day Italy. You find a multitude of different people, in those regions. And in that parish, you find that. Now, when you give this to directors and producers, it's like, too much. Too heavy. We weren't expecting that. And I said, well, this is something that you could produce and you could direct, but people get afraid of it. And they'd rather insert, this fantastic, magical person of color in this fantastic magical world instead of relating it to where the evidence leads. Moreover, in the central parish in Plymouth, the African presence is about 4% of the total population, 4% in that parish in Plymouth. So here we have an opportunity to talk about Plymouth in a way that people have never spoken about it before, using this African presence in Plymouth. And in Bristol, it's about 4% too. It's about 4% in Bristol too. So these are places, for example, like Plymouth and Bristol, certainly Plymouth, where people would not traditionally think, okay, here is a center for an African presence. So the important thing is that the Africans in the Tudor period tended to be centered, not entirely, but tended to be centered around port towns. So, for example, London, Plymouth, Bristol, etc. Right? In their first generation. But by second or third generation, they tended to have moved inland to a multitude of places. So the important thing is that this African presence isn't just about port towns. It's about villages like Holt in Worcestershire. It's about Hertfordshire. It's about Scipio Kennedy in Lanarkshire in Scotland in the 17th century. Scipio Kennedy in Lanarkshire. And Scipio Kennedy's descendants are alive today in Lanarkshire, Scotland. Henry Anthony Jetta, who is in Holt, Worcestershire, his descendants are alive today in Holt, Worcestershire, because Henry Anthony Jetta had 5 children with a woman called Placidia, and then he had another child called Cuthbert Holborn, born out of wedlock. And these 6 children went on to have many grandchildren and many great-grandchildren. And even by the beginning of the 18th century, those children were still being referenced by Henry Anthony Jetta, their ancestor, in the 16th century, the African Henry Anthony Jetta in the 16th century. Although by the end of the 18th century, they stopped referencing him. And we know why that is. It's part of the same thing that we've just been talking about. The same thing about, making sure that if you've got that kind of history, you hide that history. So there's many people in England who might classify themselves now today as Hearts of Oak, Anglo-Saxon, Vikings and what have you. But in fact, when they look through their family tree, they find people of African descent staring back at them.
And it's amazing that if you were to, it's amazing how quickly such a presence and a footprint gets absorbed, so much so that it completely disappears. I'm thinking now about a phenomenon that you mentioned in your book about how the names themselves could start off within one generation or two at least, you've got someone being referenced with a surname like Blackamoor, but that becoming Moore, and you have a Sarah Moore. And by the time you're certainly in the 19th century, lily white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Sarah Moore would tell you that no, she, straight face, she does not have any black in her family. It's just the name. It's just
Absolutely.
probably maybe to do with the Moors. They lived in the Yorkshire Moors at some point, and
That's
they
right.
farmed the Moors.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
documented this phenomenon, how the names disappear and get absorbed
Absolutely.
into the community. Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. Thank you ever so much for asking me that question. And it's about how terms and terminologies that may be ethnic sobriquets, these are terms that are used to describe ethnicity, become names, titles, before losing their ethnic identity and their own visibility, and just become names or noms, Nome. So I'll give an example. Henry Anthony Jetto Blackamoor is baptized as Henry Anthony Jetto Blackamoor. The word jet refers to blackness, the word black refers to blackness, and the word Moor refers to blackness. That means he's referred to 3 times as being black. Right? Okay. But by the 18th century, his descendants are known simply as Jet. By the 19th century, his descendants are known as Jetter. The modern day descendants of Holt Worcestershire are known as Jetter, Jetter. The original jet word, French meaning black, has been lost. Yes? Or what we say, changed, transformed into the word Jetter. This is a constant phenomenon. That we see with people's modern names like Black and Blackley, whose names, not in all cases, but sometimes these are ethnic sobriquets used in the parish record that become names, last names, before losing their ethnic distinctiveness and becoming something else. This is definitely a pattern that we see amongst a number of people, descendants of people inside the English archives.
So it seems to me then that, to recapitulate and to summarize so far, there are quite it's an understatement to put it this way, but I will put it this way anyway. There will be quite a number of blacks living almost absorbed into the English society in the Tudor era. This is as early as the Tudor era in the Renaissance England, and they're living and they're doing their thing. They're just part of sort of the English milieu, as you might want to put it. But is it necessarily the case then, Doctor, that these are always slaves and or servants? Because that's something as well that we get a lot whenever blacks are portrayed in depicted in these spaces that they shouldn't be, according to some. They're always portrayed as either slaves or subservient.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good question. Thank you. So the science of race that we're living in the legacy of says that people of African descent have played no part in European history. And the only part that rather unwillingly the presence is willing to be acknowledged as being significant is in relation to enslavement. So there may be a willingness to acknowledge, yes, you were enslaved, and you were enslaved in different parts of the world, and that's your contribution to history. So this kind of notion, mostly from the 18th century, gets played backwards to the 17th, 16th, 15th, 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, all the way back in time, as a way of not exploring these people's presence, status, and origin. And it's the reason why when I wrote Blackamoors, it's called the presence, status, and origins of Africans in Tudor England. These words aren't chosen lightly, but on purpose. Because in Blackamoors, and in England's other countries, in which I take the argument a little bit further, because I'm talking about the curse of Ham, but within Blackamoors, I pick apart the notion, number one, of what is a slave, and number two, whether and how that terminology is used to describe not only people of African descent, but others also present within early modern English society. The key thing is that when people use terms like slave, it stops their thinking about who these people are. And so by labeling people as slaves, when often there is no evidence to support such a label, this becomes a convenient way of saying that these people aren't important. Oh yes, there may have been some of them, but they were all slaves then. Oh, we don't need to think about them then. They didn't have any status, or they're just inferior. That's a way of looking at them. Okay, now going to the next point. What was their status then? Well, their status would vary. Like most people in Tudor society, most people in Tudor society had a low status. They were servants, they were workers in the fields, they were laborers, they labored for people of position, status, and power. And we find people of African descent in those positions as servants, as laborers. But we also find people of African descent as clerks, as merchants. We have the famous African who lives in Cheapside. This African in Cheapside, living in, we don't know his name, but living in Cheapside between 1553 and 1558. This African had a fantastic skill for the creation of Spanish needles. These were needles formed from steel. It appears that in 1553, he was the only person in England who had this skill for making Spanish needles. Why did he have this skill for making Spanish needles? Because he came from Spain. And in Cheapside, he sort of cornered the market and produced these needles, and had this skill and kept this art, as they say, entirely to himself. He refused to share it. He refused to share it with anybody. When he died, the art died with him. And it wasn't for several years, many, many years afterwards, until it was resurrected by a European coming from Italy and from what is now modern day Germany, who brought that art with them. But the first person in England to fashion these steel needles, these special Spanish needles, was this African living in Cheapside in London. So these people that I'm describing now, like Henry Anthony Jetta, like this African in Cheapside who owns his own shop producing steel needles. These people are not enslaved people. These are artisans. These are merchants. These are businessmen. These are visiting dignitaries like Deirdre Dranqua. Deirdre Dranqua comes to England at the beginning of the 1600s. Deirdre Dranqua is baptized in Tottenham, in North London. Deirdre Dranqua comes with his entourage. Why does he come to England? Because he's sent out of England by his father, the king. He's sent out of England to learn about the Christian religion. Why is he sent out of his country to England to learn about Christian? Because they believe, for the purpose of strategy and diplomacy, that by understanding and becoming Christians, they would have access to the weapons that Christians created, in particular the gun and the cannon. The cannon, in fact, was more important than the gun in the 1600s. And they wanted this technology. And part of them getting a hold of this technology was to become a Christian, which is why you see people like Deirdre Dranqua, people like Walter and Nana Berry, Walter Ananaberry, the son of Nossa Ananaberry, also from West Africa, also sent out by his father to England to get baptized at the end of the 16th century. So these are visiting dignitaries, these are princes, sent, West African princes, sent to England at the end of the Elizabethan period and the beginning of the Stuart period to get baptized. But of course, there are people who are servants.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in service in the great houses. And there are people who start off in service and then rise up in position. There are people like Catalina de Mottral. Catalina de Mottral was the handmaiden for Catherine of Aragon. She was the lady of the bedchamber for Catherine of Aragon. Catalina de Mottral was married to Ovidio, a Moorish crossbow maker. Catalina de Mottral is very important because as Catalina's bed mistress, as a mistress of the bedchamber, she was responsible for the collection of sheets every night after Catherine of Aragon woke up. So therefore, she was very familiar with her monthly cycle, right? And was be well aware of whether, for example, the wedding night had been consummated. That's why Catalina de Mottral was called to give evidence in the famous trial about whether Catherine of Aragon had a relationship with Henry VIII's brother before she had married Henry VIII. Whether that marriage, that relationship had been consummated. Because what people don't often know is that Catherine of Aragon had originally been betrothed to Henry's brother, who was called Arthur. Arthur died. Catherine then got married to Henry. That marriage could only be legal if the first relationship had not been consummated. Catherine said that relationship had never been consummated. But Catalina was called to give evidence about whether that relationship had been consummated because of the lady of the bedchamber. She had all the control of her mistress's sheets. That's the quote, right? So Catalina de Mottral is vitally important to the future of this country. Vitally important. And the evidence that she gives is vitally important. So what I'm trying to say is that these people are inexplicably connected to some of the most important events in English history. They are connected. They are fundamentally connected to the history of this country. Another example, Walter Raleigh. Walter Raleigh has as his secondary navigator a person of African descent called Diego. He's called Diego Negro, which means Diego the Black. Diego Negro is a cormorant or a cormorant. In other words, he is a maroon, an African maroon, who joins Francis. Sorry, not Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake. Let's go back a bit. So I'm not talking about Walter Raleigh, I'm talking about Francis Drake. So Francis Drake has a secondary navigator called Diego Negro. The Diego Negro is is a maroon who seeks sanctuary with Francis Drake and helps Francis Drake circumnavigate the globe, right? And Francis Drake could become the first thing. Now, how does he help? Because he understands the passages. He understands the seas around the Caribbean. He understands the seas around North America, and therefore is able to supply him with information to help circumnavigate the globe. Unfortunately, Diego is injured and doesn't finish the journey. Before they leave, Diego Negro is present in England. He's living in Plymouth. And he's helping Francis Drake draw up plans for his circumnavigation. Why isn't Diego Negro included when we talk about Francis Drake? Why isn't he included? So what I'm trying to say is that in order to tell the story of the Elizabethan period, tell the story of the Tudor period, you cannot help but talk about these people of African descent. You cannot help but do it. It's not possible to do it. It's not possible.
Uh, there's this Catalina that you mentioned. Now, just to go back to something we said earlier, we've had I can't tell you the number of I like them. I absolutely enjoy them. I'm in the middle of one right now. I need to complete with the missus over a glass of wine or something on a Friday evening. But these Tudor period dramas, The Other Boleyn Girl, A Man of All Seasons, Wolf Hall, I've never once seen any character supposedly depicting this Catalina. Now, we live in 2025 and this is supposedly the quote woke era. How what an opportunity! What an opportunity to centerpiece somebody like that, but yet we don't know about her. We don't know about her, and instead, as you said, you
Yeah,
they will present these fantasy or fantasy blacks that
certainly.
are just out of nowhere. That's for me.
Certainly.
I'm I will go there. I will say that's not by accident. That cannot be by accident.
Yeah,
I'm very dubious
yeah,
about things like
absolutely.
that. But I also want to say
So
this.
yeah,
Go on, go
okay,
on.
all right. Okay, what I was going to say is that certainly there are no people of African descent in A Man for All Seasons, the film version, if we're talking about by Robert Bolt.
No.
There are no people of African descent in Anne of the Thousand Days, nor is there any in Elizabeth R, the Glenda Jackson series, or Henry VIII and his six wives. There is no reference. But there is Catalina de Mocho is visible and called Catalina in a TV series called The Spanish Princess. And she does
Mm,
play a significant and important role. She plays actually the appropriate role that she had at the time, and it's a good thing to watch.
I'm gonna
There
check that
are
out.
occasionally, yeah, the Spanish Princess. So there have been some programs where, okay, they've tried to do that. And these are people, in some cases, that have spoken to me or spoken to other people like me and said, look, what's this all about? We don't understand what we're meant to do with this. And I say, look, read this, read that, read this. I don't give them the story. I give them evidence. I say, look at that original evidence. Look at that original evidence. Look at that original evidence. When you've done that, then you come back to me. So I send them away to go and do some reading. And sometimes they do the reading, sometimes they don't. If they do the
Mm,
reading, they come back to me and say, "Oh, that's it. How do we make sense of it?" I said, "Then we talk, then we consult."
mm,
And that's what happened with the Spanish Princess. They do that. Sometimes they get the wrong end of the stick. That they look at it. For example, there was a recent Anne Boleyn series or TV show where they had a woman of African descent who was playing Anne Boleyn. There's no evidence to support that. She certainly at times
mm.
is described as being dark, but the darkness isn't the darkness of complexion, the darkness of hair.
Right.
And I know why they were doing that sort of colorblind casting. I know why, but there's no evidence to support that she was a person of African Caribbean descent. But what they and there is occasionally a TV company or a director will listen to your advice and then go in the exact opposite way and go in the exact opposite direction, which is entirely, of course, their own choice.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, there are some descriptions of Anne Boleyn as swarthy. I was reading in
Mm.
preparation for this interview of her described as swarthy complexion, and then her mother, obviously Elizabeth, is as well. I'm not going to go as far as to say that they were of African descent or looked even of African descent, but it's interesting that those descriptions are there. And for me, knowing what I know now, as opposed to what I knew even just a year or 2 years ago, it wouldn't surprise
Yeah,
me if, there's some ancestry in there because, again, what we're
Yes,
finding, the pattern we're finding is that there are more people of African or black descent in
absolutely.
England in this time than we've been led to believe. And if that's the case, it stands to reason that they could easily just disappear into the records and into the background, especially considering
Absolutely.
what you've said about how records are being retrospectively, especially in the 19th century, we're being retrospectively. I can certainly now that I've heard what you've said
Certainly.
so far, I
Yeah.
can definitely imagine a bad actor in the 19th century just clipping out any evidence of this ancestry to Elizabeth or Anne Boleyn. We know, of course, Anne Boleyn wasn't the most let's say faithful. There's stories about her, let's say,
We,
faithful
we
of
have to be careful with that too. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. But we have to be careful with that too. But absolutely. I mean, there is a tradition in English record keeping of describing people as black or swarthy who
mm,
have dark hair, or those who have ancestral links back to those people who are also swarthy or black, although whether that swarthiness or blackness is a kind of swarthiness or blackness that relates to an African identity or another kind of identity is still a matter of investigation. In
mm,
some
mm,
cases it does, and in some cases it doesn't. Because we are living in very cynical times,
mm.
historians like myself tend to be reluctant to claim unless there's hard evidence. When the hard
Yes.
evidence is found, then we claim. If it
Mm,
isn't, we wait. And we say at the moment there is no evidence. Yeah?
mm.
Or we still
Because if
are
we're not
investigating. This,
and that's very wise, because if we're not careful about that, the bad actors that want to claim that there's no evidence for any of the
certainly,
legitimate black presence can seize on that and then say, well,
certainly.
there you go, they're
That's
claiming
right.
things without evidence. So we do have to be careful with that. I do. That's a
That's
very
right.
important point there. It's a very
and
important
and
point.
we've got so many people at the moment that we can explore. There are, for example, the people of African descent inside the Scottish court in the 15th and 16th century. These fantastically interesting people include people like Peter de Maurienne. Peter de Maurienne. So Peter is an event planner, a drummer, and a musician employed by King Henry IV of Scotland to organise the Black Lady Days, or the Romance of the Wild Knight. This is where King James IV dressed up as a wild or black knight to
Mm,
serenade a woman of African descent called Anne More or Ellen More. Anne More and Ellen More were two women of African descent who probably came from Spain, who were captured by Andrew Barton of Overbarton, brought to Scotland, and became the toast of Scottish society. And Peter de Maurienne, an African, was there to organize these events and make them in the European style so that they were worthy not only of the Scottish court, but of events that might take place in Europe. Yeah. So just to recap, because there's a lot of stuff there, people's minds will be jumping all over the place. We have the King of Scotland serenading two women that they each took turns to play the part, Anne More and Ellen More, two women. The word More definitely is an ethnic sobriquet. These
mm,
two women had been captured by Andrew Barton of Overbarton, who was a pirate, and brought to Scotland. Peter de Maurienne, another person of African descent, organized the events for them, and those events were known as the Romance of the Wild Knight or the Black Lady Days. Now, all of this is happening in the 16th century, 1500s, at the same time that John Blank, the Black Trumpeter, was performing the Westminster Tournament Roll in 1511. or Westminster Tournament events in 1511 and displayed on the Westminster Tournament roll. So this is all happening. You know, this is a fantastically important thing. Just taking Peter the Mauryan a little bit. So Peter the Mauryan, he has taken this name Mauryan not only because it relates to Moorishness, but because Mauryan was a classical mythological person. Mauryan was a knight of mythology in King Arthur's Round Table. He is a black knight, described as black, black within black. The only thing white is the white of his eyes. He's described as the most powerful and the strongest knight of his time. He comes to England, according to the mythology, looking for his father because he's dual heritage. When he finds his father, he brings his father back to his mother, who lives in Moorish lands, so that he will no longer be illegitimate. The story is called The Romance of Mauryan. Mauryan is a famous figure in English mythology as one of King Arthur's knights. It is highly significant, therefore, that in English history, a real African called Peter would take that name as his title. It means, therefore, not only does he understand this history that I've just been talking to you about, but he wants to claim it as his own. It's fantastic. It's not just by chance. So all of this stuff that I've just been explaining to you is immensely important and significant. And we don't need to make up stuff because there's so much already there. We don't need to make up stuff.
That's the stuff of an amazing movie. I'm thinking of, I don't know if you remember, I'm of the age that I can remember Sean Connery in the first, is it the first night or the last night? And I don't remember seeing any Moriens in amongst his knights on the round table. That would have been, just as an aesthetic thing, that would have been an amazing what's the word, installment in that movie to have a character play that part. But I want to do this because I've not got you for much long, but I need to touch on this. You mentioned Spain. Briefly, could you tell us what's happening? I think you mentioned Spain just now. What's happening in Spain to bring so many blacks and Moors and people of African descent into England, and amongst which you record this in your book, both of your books, amongst which are Jews, black Jews. What's happening, and where did these populations go in the end? Where did they diffuse to? For example, where did the black Jews go end up in the end?
Yes, good. Thank you for that. In the 8th century, in 711, a person called Gibril al-Tariq, that the Rock of Gibraltar is named after, came from North Africa. His population, the people that he brought, were mostly people of West African origin, but with a mixture of some pheasants. He says about a tenth were those of Western Asian descent and North African descent. But the vast majority of those came from, who had heritage from Northwest Africa. These people, these original Moorish population that arrived in 711, conquered large parts of what is now the Iberian Peninsula. It wasn't called Spain or Portugal at the time, it was simply the Iberian Peninsula, a series of tribal peoples who inhabited it. These Moorish people conquered these territories and were a dominant population there. As a result of their conquest, in the middle part of the 8th century, the popes blessed a number of the kings of Europe to begin the Reconquesta. The Reconquesta was to take back the Iberian Peninsula. This is the Western Crusade. People don't often understand that apart from the Eastern Crusade that happened later for the rescue of the Holy Land, there was also a Western Crusade. There were kings of England involved in the Western Crusade too, including Edward I, who was involved in it and actually got injured there and almost died as a result of it. So his connection to the Moors is very, very, very strong. So the Western Crusade was about taking back the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish holds. This began almost a 1,000-year conflict that began in 711 and wasn't ended till about the middle part of the 17th century. A 1,000-year conflict. During this 1,000-year conflict, there are immense movements of people. There were recurring African invasions, people coming from West Africa, like the Almoravids, coming from West Africa into North Africa and then invading the Iberian Peninsula. There are other groups of people coming from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, and there is a smaller contingent of people coming from Asia Minor into the Iberian Peninsula. 3 sets of people. If you put all 3 sets together, colloquially, in the Iberian Peninsula, they were known as Moors, either Moors or tawny Moors or white Moors, right? These people formed the Moorish populations of the Iberian Peninsula. By the middle part of the 8th century, they lost control of parts of the central part of Spain and parts of what would later become Portugal. By the 11th and the 12th century, they were pushed into a region that is often called Andalusia. Most etymologists say that this means land of light, although some people have said it is related to the Vandals. I tend to think that it means Andalusia, land of light, and therefore has a relationship to the Arabic that many of these Moorish people would have been speaking and writing in. These kingdoms, these Moorish kingdoms, became a haven for the dispossessed, for Protestants from various parts of Europe, frightened of the Catholic orthodoxy of places like Castile or Aragon, frightened of what became the Spanish Inquisition, frightened of the politics and the ideology, what was happening in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, and people went to Andalusia to escape that persecution, including Sephardi Jewish populations, Hebrews, who seeking freedom from anti-Semitism and persecution that was happening in northern Spain. The result was that in Andalusia, a very interesting mixture of cultures and peoples took place. Very interesting mixture of culture and peoples took place under the authority of Muslim Moorish rulers. The last independent Moorish kingdom was destroyed in 1492, the same year that Cristobal Colon, the person that they call Christopher Columbus, got lost and went to the Americas. Same year, 1492. The last Moorish kingdom, Granada, was defeated, the last one, 1492. Bobadil, who was the ruler in the Moorish kingdoms, left in disgrace and went to North Africa in absolute disgrace. Many of the Moors and the Jewish people who had mixed with the Moors remained. Some of them left, but many of them remained. But they remained with a very lowered status. So, as part of the conditionality of their remain, they were forced to wear badges. Badges, just like in Nazi Germany. They were forced to wear badges. These badges denoted whether they were Moors, whether they were Muslim, whether they were Jewish, and even if they converted, sometimes they were still forced to wear badges, revealing that they were conversos or Moriscos. Conversos and Moriscos is the name given to those people who are converted from Judaism into Christianity. Morisco, the name given to those Muslims or those people of Moorish descent who were converted to Christianity. They still had to wear the labels and the badges. So this was an extraordinarily ethnically inscriptive society. but for the next 250 years, they still remained until many of the persecutions of the middle part of the 17th century. The last Moorish people who were part of these populations were removed in the 1630s and the 1640s as a result of a further set of persecutions during the middle part of the 17th century. These people, therefore, were subject from 1492 to the middle part of the 17th century to immense persecution and immense ethnically inscriptive activities which dehumanized the population, including the removal of Moorish children from their families, forced conversion into Christianity, their cultural practices were made illegal, the cultural dances, songs, language were made illegal. As a result, many of those people, rather than suffer that persecution, fled. They fled to France, they fled to North Africa, they fled to West Africa, they fled to East Africa, they fled to Asia Minor, and some of them fled to England.
People got around. People got around. This it amazes me. It amazes me how dynamic societies, very far-flung, separate, geographically separate societies, how dynamic they actually were. People of, it seems to me that lack of planes and cars has never really stopped human beings from just getting to where they want to get to. Last question.
Even more so. Yeah.
So yeah, go on. Sorry,
even more so. If I can just stop you for a moment. Even more so because you must remember that in this time there isn't somebody waiting at the border with a submachine gun. There's nobody at the border.
Wow.
There's nobody at the border. Yeah. If you arrive in Plymouth, and you've come from Iberian Spain, you're Moorish. You're a Moorish, I don't know, architect or a Moorish soldier, or you're a Jewish Sephardi, an accountant, or a Jewish Sephardi traveler, and you arrive from the persecuted Iberian Peninsula, and you arrive in Plymouth. There's not somebody that says, "Whoa, get back on the ship, get back on the boat. You're not supposed to be here." Right? You arrive, you come into the. People might wonder who you are and what you're doing here. They might. But if you're able to assimilate, if you're able to become a member of your church, people will stop asking questions because you're a member of the parish, you're a member of the church.
Right.
There aren't race relation laws. There aren't immigration laws like we now have. These things don't exist in Jewish society. The milestones to becoming are milestones that are primarily local and regional. They're about how the local community accepts you or not. Now, you have a problem if the local community doesn't accept you, or you have a problem if your local church doesn't accept you. That's where the problem arises. Not because central government is going to say, "Oh, we don't want you here."
Yeah.
Central government it doesn't have that sort of reach. It is the local parish, the parish community, the local people who are deciding who is part of their parish. And many of them decided that people could come from abroad and become members of their parish, and they did. Now, some parishes, right, might have said, "Well, you're not yet a Christian, so you're a stranger. Yeah, you don't yet until you become a Christian, you are not accepted fully. But once you become a Christian, other parishes don't do that. St. Butolph without Aldgate seem to have very open policies. I'll give an example. Mary Phyllis of Moscow was 13 years in her parish before she was baptized. Wow. 13 years before she got baptized. And she came to England with her father, Phyllis of Moscow, fleeing persecution. And her father died and she was allowed to keep living in that parish without baptism. And only when she became, fully an adult, she was what, 20, in her 20s, that then she said, okay, now I want to get baptized. And then she was welcomed in to the parish. And the record of her baptism, which is probably one of the longest records for a commoner, gives evidence of that baptism. So we have to be careful when we think about the Tudor period, because we might sometimes think of it as a period of immense intolerance. And in some respects, there is a great deal of intolerance in Tudor society, but not the kind of intolerance that we often wish to give it. People might be intolerant if you're not a member of a parish, but they would be considerably more open to different people becoming members of their parish than what we might think would be the case. So the key thing is that we shouldn't give 21st century prejudices to 16th century and 15th century English people.
Doctor, if you don't mind, can I please prevail on you for a further 10 minutes and no more than that? Is that right? Thank you. I want to ask you two things to close. First thing is this. These people in English society, you've touched on this already, but I kind of want to give you an opportunity to perhaps drive home the point, because from reading your work and from watching some of your content on YouTube, it seems to me that these black people, these people of African descent in England, are not just assimilated into the society as kind of people that we tolerate, or we just well, they're here now, so they're part of us, but they seem almost crucial to even things like the economy. You mentioned earlier this individual who we don't know his name, he brings the Spanish needle. And I found a quote in your book by a fellow who says that, quote, Spanish needles was first taught. So I was blown over by that. First taught in England by Elias Grouse, a German, about the 8th year of Queen Elizabeth. But it says that there was a Spanish Negro who made fine Spanish needles in Cheapside. It seems that this person was around before, so that's quite a contradictory statement from this individual who's writing. I believe it's a William Harrison that you quote in your book. But apparently this Moor, this Negro who made fine Spanish needles in Cheapside, quote, would never teach the art to any. So it seems like she wanted, like, I think you touched on this briefly before, it seems like this individual held a monopoly, and it doesn't seem to me anything other than you have an individual who holds a monopoly on this mechanism, this artisan art, and doesn't want to share that monopoly with anybody. Now, when this has been read by other historians, and you cite them in your work, can't quite remember the names, they read this as somebody who's holding on to what they have as a response to prejudice, but actually that doesn't seem to be what the evidence shows. It doesn't seem to be that they're tolerated. It seems like they're holding a monopoly as anybody else would naturally do. And I just want to, I'm saying all this because I want you to flesh out how actually integrated and now not integrated, integral to the community these people are. Another person, Katharina, that you mentioned with Catherine of Aragon, you said something in your book about how Moors were often employed in these sort of medical areas because they were believed to hold knowledge in such scientific fields, such fields to do with the biology in the human body. Can you elaborate on that just briefly, because I think people need to get that point as well? Sorry, go ahead.
So that's often referred to at the time as Moorish science. So Moorish science, Moorish medicine, was considered to be the counter medicine of the 15th and 16th century, or the Moorish ways. So the prevailing methodology that was opposite to that was the bleeding, the leeching. So doctors would bleed their patients, would apply leeches to their patients as a methodology of balancing the full humours. Moorish medicine enabled people to access a wide variety of different medical remedies and homeopathic remedies in an attempt to heal their patient. So this meant that Moorish customs, manners, or those that were associated as being Moorish customs and manners in relation to the medical field, became the prevailing methodologies used by 15th and 16th century doctors who wanted to adopt a methodology that was opposite to what I've just said, leeching and bleeding. So, for example, when Edward I, this is going before the Tudor period, Edward I grew sick, Moorish doctors were brought into England to save his life, and they did. And similar occurrences happen either with Moorish doctors or with doctors adopting Moorish customs and Moorish ways. And the people writing at the time don't have any problem in saying that. They don't have any problems because there's nothing at stake. You see what I mean? We're admitting that. They're just acknowledging that this is what is happening. So there is this sort of tension. So there was another question that you asked, wasn't there?
The individual at Cheapside with the Spanish needles, I just found that really fascinating. How when it's read back, the reason for such a person holding that monopoly is because it's a revenge tactic, because they were being treated badly, but there's no evidence, as you show in your book, about this.
Yeah, absolutely. To the contrary, actually, what the evidence seems to suggest is that this is a person with agency who wants to keep his power. We know this not just because of that one reference, but there are at least 4 or 5 references to him. The references continue into the 15th and the 16th century, into the beginning of the 17th century, and then they stop. References stop in the 17th century, and we know why. We've just been talking about why they stopped. The image of this needle maker was an image used by the Worshipful Company of Needle Makers, although they claim now to have lost the image. But the image of the African needle maker was part of that tradition because he was considered to be the original patron, the original father of this company, the company of Worshipful Company of Needle Makers. So there is this kind of tension. One thing that I will leave you with is St. Maurice. St. Maurice, during the 15th and the 16th century, was recognized as the patron saint of knights. St. Maurice is an African. St. Maurice is described as depicted as African, as the African part of the Theban Legion. St. Maurice Day was the most popular day, more popular than St. George's Day, where people used to blacken their faces and pretend to be St. Maurice. St. Maurice Day was in September. It was a very popular celebration throughout Europe during the 15th and the 16th century. And St. Maurice was one of the most popular saints, which is why the image of St. Maurice is over the tomb of Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor. You can see the image of St. Maurice. Now, St. Maurice's popularity is firmly linked to this presence of Africans in Tudor and early modern Europe. There is a connection between the two. These symbolic representations of divinity have a connection to the real people of African descent who populated parts of Western Europe, including this country. There is a link between the two. And I think that what's important is for us to recognize, and nobody is saying this, that every person of African descent in Western Europe or in England was a king or queen. We're not saying that. Nobody is saying that. Nobody is saying that. What we are saying is that these people had varied and different positions within English society. And some of these people may have been exalted and respected in positions and status, and even those who were not part of the higher echelons of society tended to be part of the communities in which they were part of. And moreover, we should not implant in a lazy fashion 20th century ideas and just presume that these people were enslaved when there isn't evidence to prove it.
Thank you so much, Doctor. As I said at the beginning of this, the questions could just kept on going, but at some point, I would have to have you back on this on the True Black YouTube channel. This has been excellent. Thank you so much, Doctor.